Did the resurrection really occur? Detectives investigate scenes all the time, trying to determine if a crime occurred. And if the crime did occur, who committed the crime? And often when we get there, it's not necessarily a crime has occurred. It may just look like one has occurred. So how do we know when a scene is actually a crime scene? How do we know, for example, when a death scene is actually a murder scene or a crime scene? Well, what we do is we make a list of all the evidence, and then we compare the evidence to the explanations. Evidence, explanations. Now, we include all the possible explanations to begin with, just to be open-minded, and then we look at the evidence and we begin to cross out the explanations that don't work according to the evidence. Now, that approach is called abductive reasoning, and we do this at every crime scene, at every death scene, and we do this in front of every jury. We ask them to examine both cases, prosecution, defense, and decide which is most reasonable in light of evidence. Well, as I was investigating the resurrection, I knew that there were a number of ways to explain the evidence in the crime scene. Now, I would not have said I trusted much of the evidence, but I would have agreed to four simple things that I would have said were true about the story of the resurrection. I would have said, as an atheist, that I believe that Jesus lived and died on a cross and was buried. That's unremarkable. I don't think that that means Christianity is true, but that could happen. It's fine. Doesn't mean the resurrection occurred. I would have also said that the tomb was empty because, yeah, you could falsify this pretty quickly in the first century by showing the body of Jesus. No one ever did that, but that does not mean that Christianity is true. I would have said that it's true that the disciples claimed to see the risen Christ, but that doesn't even mean they saw him, really. I don't necessarily think that's true, but all those things could be true, that there was a Jesus lived and died on a cross, that he was buried, that there was an empty tomb, and that the disciples said they saw him alive. All that could be true, yet Christianity could still be false. It depends on how you explain it. One last thing, I would have said, yeah, the disciples seemed like they were pretty convinced by this and their lives were transformed. So what? Lots of people have their lives transformed. Does not mean Christianity is true. But if I list those four pieces of evidence, lived, died on a cross, was buried, empty tomb, sightings of the resurrection, they were transformed by it, I still have to explain those four pieces of evidence. So I explain them one of 6 or 7 ways. Maybe they lied about it. Maybe he wasn't really dead on the cross. Maybe they hallucinated it. Somebody saw it and imagined it, but they were so influential they convinced everybody else that they saw it. Maybe an imposter sat in his place. Maybe they changed the story over time and just embellished it with legend. Maybe it just happened. Maybe the resurrection just happened the way reported. So I can think of some ways to explain this, and all I did was go through all the explanations, trying to see which ones worked based on the evidence. As a result, I determined that I think he died on the cross. He wasn't really alive, so he really did die on the cross, and I don't think they lied about it. I don't think they hallucinated it. I don't think one person hallucinated it and convinced the others. I don't think there was an imposter. I don't think it's a late legend. I've gone through all of those explanations trying to see if any of those were true. As an atheist, I really thought one of those must be true. But I will tell you right now, those classic explanations for that simple 4 pieces of evidence, they just don't work. Now, the other alternative is that it really happened. And I was hesitant to accept that because it requires a resurrection, right? And I rejected resurrections. I rejected supernatural things. But it turns out my rejection of supernatural things was not really based on evidence as much as it was based on my own presuppositional bias against the supernatural. If I just removed my bias against the supernatural, the explanation that explains those 4 pieces of evidence most clearly, most robustly, most thoroughly is the Christian explanation. What kept me from the Christian explanation for all those years was simply my commitment to my own philosophical naturalism. I refused to admit to a miracle. I refused to think that anything supernatural could happen. So the resurrection wasn't even available to my options back in those days. But once I realized that that might not be reasonable, I also realized that the only thing that had ever been standing between me and the truthfulness of the resurrection was me, my own bias against the supernatural. And once I decided to lay that down, clearly, the best and most reasonable explanation for the evidence is the Christian explanation. That those documents that are so early, so well transmitted, so verified by archaeology, by all kinds of internal and external evidences, even documents that lack bias, that lack any prejudice that would cause people to lie. That was the most reasonable explanation. And that's when I decided to take a serious look at Jesus of Nazareth. Not because I was looking for a Messiah at the time, I wasn't, but I just discovered that the resurrection actually occurred. And once that was determined, once I could see that was the case, what choice did I have but to embrace the Savior who rose from the grave?